Greetings and welcome to another episode of Music is a Journey. I'm Peter Scove, and today I thought I would talk a bit about some proto-metal. Because just what the internet needs right now is another middle-aged white guy talking about his favorite music from the 70s and the 80s. Okay, so what are we talking about with proto-metal? Proto-metal is the term that is used these days to describe anything that had elements of heavy metal generally prior to about 1975-1976. The Metal Music Archives uses 1976 as the cutoff year for proto-metal, but you will find some overlap because, for example, early albums by Black Sabbath are very clearly heavy metal, as well as some other tracks coming in here and there from some other bands. But generally speaking, we are talking about bands who are playing heavy guitar, distorted guitar music, powerful vocals, that rhythm section, and so on. Around, well, even early elements coming in through the 1960s. But I want to focus today specifically on 1969-1970. Two reasons for that. One, I believe, as do some others, that the first generation of heavy metal, the first wave of heavy metal, actually occurred between 1969 and 1971, with some continuing on into 1972. This is a kind of general statement, though, because I know, for example, Martin Popoff, the heavy metal music journalist, he describes ye old heavy metal, I think it's an ebook, he describes it from 1968 to 1972. Whereas the American music journalist Lester Bangs, he actually once wrote a book on the history of heavy metal, describing it from 1966 to 1984 at the time, I think it was. I think he died shortly after that, or somebody finished it for him, not sure. But anyway, I see 1968 as being the crucial year where the necessary ingredients for heavy metal really start to come together as a viable music format. And then by 1969, we start to see bands who are actually recording whole albums, or most of the albums are heavy like that. So, I want to talk about albums from 1969-1970, partly because that, for me, is the beginning of it, and it is also around the time that the term heavy metal started, was actually first put into place, and we're going to talk about that on another episode, get into those details there. But for now, let's take a look at some of the albums that were released in 1969-1970. I'm going to do another video for 71-72 later on. So today, let's take a look at 69-70. Kind of in alphabetical order, but because I pulled CDs from 3 different boxes, kind of not. We're going to first of all take a look at 2 Canadian bands. The one you see over here now on the display, this is Warpig. Warpig were a band that formed in 1968, and they released their one and only album in 1970, and I believe they continued on till about 1972. Warpig had one song which stirred up some attention, and more recently you can find it showing up on the internet, because their song Rockstar sounds an awful lot like Deep Purple's Fireball. Now the curious thing is that they originally wrote Rockstar in 68-69 and recorded it for their album 1970. Deep Purple's Fireball came out in 1971. Deep Purple are known for having music that is strikingly similar to other music. Some more famous than others. But anyway, that's Warpig's kind of claim to fame. They were a hard rock, almost basically heavy band of 1970, this album here. Hammond organ as well. Some great fast songs, good riffs. Quite a good album if you want to check it out. Okay, next up we have a band called Dionysus from Quebec. They are more commonly known as being part of the 1970s Quebecois prog movement. But this early album here from 1970, should be 70, it is a heavy guitar, heavy organ, psychedelic, blues-based album, and overall quite good. The last track though, however, Agneau des Dieux, this one is really like doom, especially in the last 2 minutes or so of the song. It changes into this really buzzing, heavy guitar riff. The band comes in like all boom, 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 and the singer is just like shouting out I will die in French. Je vais mourir, like this. That's pretty damn cool. Sends shivers down my spine every time I hear it. So, heavy psychedelic, heavy 1970s rock on this Dionysus album here. Let's move along now to Andromeda. Now this one actually shows up quite a lot when people are talking about early heavy rock or proto-metal albums, because this album is a lot of heavy stuff on here, and if you listen to the intro to Return to Sanity, it is exactly the Holst Planet's Mars bit, that dun dun dun, which is of course the riff which Tony Iommi altered for Black Sabbath's song Black Sabbath. Down, 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 right? That Holt's Planets thing shows up here, 1969 recording. You can also hear it showing up later on Diamond Head and Triumph and probably some other bands as well. Nice heavy guitar riff. The rest of the album also features a lot of guitar-based hard rock and also leaning a bit towards progressive rock as well. The guitarist is John Ducan, who we know later on from Atomic Rooster. Also, he previously joined a band called The Attack, and if you find some of The Attack's late 60s stuff, there are also some really good heavy tracks on there as well, which I'll probably talk about in some future video. Okay, Andromeda. This is a double CD, by the way. Okay, here we have Asterix. Now, Asterix, this is the proto-Lucifer's Friend. This is a band that recorded an album before changing their name to Lucifer's Friend and going on recording that album, which we'll talk about in a bit. The singer is John Lawton, who also we know from Lucifer's Friend, and who later on sang with Uriah Heep in the late 70s for 3 of their albums. Basically, it is hard guitar rock, early 70s, organ-based as well, and lots of groove. They actually do have 2 singles on here recorded in 1970, which is before John Lawton joined. And Everybody, quite a fun song, similar to Give Me Some Lovin'. Okay, so there's Asterix. Now we have a band out of Texas, probably one of the America's most famous early heavy bands. This is Blood Rock. Their first 3 albums there's 3 or 4 albums follow that heavy guitar, heavy organ type rock. A bit groovy in a way as well. I find some of the songs are not really as easy for me to get into because they lack the really heavy stuff. But on this debut album, of course, Melvin Laid an Egg, really well-known heavy 1970 guitar riff. I also like Wicked Truth, which also has a really nice heavy riff. So very good heavy guitar riffs on here, lots of organ, lots of groove. I think it's the drummer, sorry I forgot his name now, who's doing the vocals. Very powerful vocalist. Definitely an album to check out if you like this kind of early heavy stuff with organ. Speaking of which, Euclid, Heavy Equipment. Now, I'm actually not sure when this was released. It says they formed in 1970. They recorded 1 album. They had 3 lead guitarists. All right. Heavy Equipment. This album has a lot of heavy psychedelic rock. They do an excellent cover of Gimme Some Lovin' on here. Some stranger stuff coming from the psychedelic corner, but overall really fuzzy heavy guitar riffs. The only negative thing to say is that the recording of this is pretty weak. I think it went from somebody's pretty decent vinyl copy, and well, when you listen to it you can get into it, but it's not hi-fi, not even for the year. So, Light My Fire, the Firebirds, and Hair, the 31 Flavors. The Firebirds and the 31 Flavors, and later I think the Fabulous Firebirds, they're basically the same band, and this was basically a band which were hired as session musicians for songs that Crown Records wanted to release. Now these are famous songs, like some songs from the musical Hair, as well as Light My Fire, which are pretty poor, especially the Hair ones. They sound really terrible, actually. However, the rest of the album is made up of songs recorded by the band, which is really heavy psychedelic stuff. And I think it is a track called Distortions, which is the Distortions of Darkness, which is the famous one that gets around on the internet. Lots of heavy, fuzz-toned, sometimes Jimi Hendrix, sometimes Blue Cheer influence type stuff. Kind of amateur. A lot of it sounds like the band rehearsing for their songs or doing a demo of their songs. It doesn't sound like this was intended to be out for mainstream release, but, you know, to dip back into the early days of heavy metal. I believe the 31 Light My Fire one is from 68 and the Hair one is from 69. Next up, I want to point out High Tide's debut album in 1969, Sea Shanties. This features Tony Hill on guitar. They also have a violinist, and this makes High Tide a kind of early proto-prog metal band because they have the heavy riffs, they have even some very doomy lyrics, but they also have the violinist in there, and so they do a lot of this, what they called it, quasi-baroque rock type stuff, longer compositions, some instrumentals, lots of instrumental showcasing. So they are this kind of proto-metal but also early prog band as well. Tony Hill, I found it very interesting when I was reading about the history of a band called The Misunderstood out of California in the 1960s. They went to the UK and at the behest of John Peel, who said that they would have a good chance with their music in the UK, which was very Yardbirds influenced at the time. And their guitarist decided he was going to leave amicably, and so they recruited Tony Hill on guitar. And the vocalist Richard Brown, together with Tony Hill, began writing some songs, and they came out with some great, really kind of heavy and almost early progressive stuff recorded late in 69, and they were going to be the sound of 67. They ran into a whole bunch of trouble though. The singer got drafted to fight in the Vietnam War. He ran off to India. I have a book all about that. But anyway, Tony Hill was in that band and later on started High Tide. The opening riff of the opening track, Nihilist's Lament, I think it is, really great heavy riff. The problem is you cannot find this on YouTube, and I actually made a compilation video using just 10-second clips from heavy guitar riffs from the early 70s, and I opened it with this one, and after about half a year it got blocked. The record company found out I put it on YouTube, so I got blocked. Too bad. Anyway, really interesting, cool album. Not always great, but the great parts are really great, and the heavy guitar riffs are wonderful. Speaking of heavy guitar riffs, we move on to Iron Claw. Now, Iron Claw got their name from the opening lyrics of King Crimson's 21st Century Schizoid Man. Cat's paw, Iron Claw, something like that. Okay, now their thing is that they started out heavily influenced by Black Sabbath. Now we're talking 69, 1970, so this is all kind of happening around the same time. And in their early shows, they would play Black Sabbath's debut album in its entirety. So they became really good at playing Black Sabbath style. Then they recorded some of their own tracks in a 4-track studio. Especially Skull Crusher. Wow, really awesome stuff for the time. Unfortunately, the recording is not very good, and the vocalist sounds like a member who sang until they got a proper vocalist, so the vocals are a bit weak. Skull Crusher, amazing. It has this riff. They sent their recording off to Black Sabbath's management to see if they would, the Black Sabbath's management would be interested in taking on the band, and they were basically told, stop recording that type of music. It's too close to what we're doing. But it's different enough that it sounds like another heavy doom type band. Not exactly like Black Sabbath. The rest of the songs on this album, those songs were from 1970. The rest of them move on through to 1974. You see the band experimenting more. They get a proper vocalist. There's some flute coming in. It gets a little bit more progressive. But still they have some really heavy guitar tracks. But those first 5 or 6 tracks on here, great early heavy metal. Nice. Hey, how about Iron Maiden? Let's talk about Iron Maiden. Okay, this is a band who formed in Essex and the Essex area of London in the late 60s, and they went through some name changes. They decided to call their band Bum, capital B-U-M, and I think it was the girlfriend of one of the musicians. Her father agreed to manage them if they changed their name. So they tossed around some ideas and decided to call themselves Iron Maiden. Interestingly enough, there was actually another band called Iron Maiden, which existed briefly in the 1970s, but didn't record anything, before finally Steve Harris put together a band and called it Iron Maiden in 1976. Anyway, this album, what's it like? Well, they have tracks like God of Darkness and Falling Liar Ritual. They wanted to write a little bit more about kind of black magic and rituals and a little bit on the dark side of things. But it is considered a heavy psychedelic album. They do have lots of guitar soloing, and it is a guitar-based band. They don't really go into the distortion so much, so you'd think if they had plugged in the distortion pedal, it might have come out a little more metallic, but the bass is still there, and a lot of people on the internet like this one here. It actually was an album that was recorded, never released, discovered in the 90s, released as an LP, and then finally brought out on CD later on. So, anyway, Iron Maiden. The original Iron Maiden. Okay. Oh, interestingly, I should add that the album was called Maiden Voyage, and in later years, Iron Maiden released a live album recorded in the late 70s, also called Maiden Voyage. Alright. Leafhound, Growers of Mushroom, with Peter French on vocals. We're going to talk about Peter French in a later episode. Leafhound and Growers of Mushroom sounds like a really pot-smoking type album. Apparently, though, Leafhound was named after a horror story where there was a hound spirit that, I guess, could attract leaves to itself so that you could see it. But it was actually the spirit of a deceased dog. And Growers of Mushroom, I think that was also based on a short horror story. So, surprisingly, it has nothing to do with drugs. But 1970 album, Anyway, this is not really heavy metal, but very good hard rock, hard guitar-based rock, and an album that is frequently mentioned as proto-metal. I find it to be a little bit more closer to the hard rock side to be really metal, but Pete French, great vocalist, sang with Atomic Rooster, sang with Cactus, so yeah, I said we'll talk about him later. Okay, here we have it, Lucifer's Friend. So we talked about Asterix, Lucifer's Friend, a German heavy rock band that later, by their second, third, fourth album, were spreading out into progressive territory a bit more. This album here, recorded in 1970 or 71, around then, with John Lawton on vocals, the sole non-German guy. Famous album. Their first track on here, Ride the Sky, sounds like it's borrowing from Led Zeppelin's Immigrant Song, although there is some debate who came first. Not sure. But anyway, organ, heavy guitar. If you like Uriah Heep, this is in that kind of category, or like also a Deep Purple in rock type of stuff. Powerful vocals, distorted guitar, heavy organ. Basically a great album. The title track, or actually the song Lucifer's Friend on here, has a really killer riff, and John Lawton just ripping out on the screaming vocals. Cool stuff. I think everybody knows about Leslie West and Mountain, and of course Mississippi Queen. Well, Mississippi Queen and Boys in the Band, I think it is. No, it's not Boys in the Band. Crap, forgot the other one. Anyway, a good hard rock album with some very good heavy riffing, still basically on this kind of American, slightly southern influenced heavy rock. But yeah, cool album to check out if you're interested in that kind of thing. I had to have it anyway. 1970 release, so fits in nicely with that. Now, let's head over to Peru and let's talk about this band, Pax. Pax recorded a number of singles, and I think even an album or so, in between 69, 70, 71. They were one of the first bands overseas to get a taste of Black Sabbath. They had heard an early single, might have been Evil Woman or something like that, and they went ahead and recorded 2 of their own songs. Titles I forgot right now, but The Storyless Junkie, maybe Rock and Ball, Firefly, that's it. Really heavy again. 1969, very heavy stuff, clearly drawing directly from Black Sabbath, but doing things their own way. I think there's more of the organ sound, actually more like Uriah Heep sound, Firefly is. Yeah, Firefly. Uriah Heep did an album called Firefly in 1977. Anyway, they also did a lot of covers, including Smoke on the Water, which is actually quite a good one, and I've heard other reviewers say Pax's cover of Smoke on the Water is very nicely done. So we have an album, I guess, plus bonus tracks. Pax, May God and your will land you and your soul miles away from evil. What a long title. Anyway, very cool. You can probably check out A Storyless Junkie on YouTube. I'm sure it's there. Maybe you can find Firefly as well as some other things. Interesting. An obscure band whose album I think was never actually released in the beginning. This is St. Anthony's Fire. Fire spelled with a Y because they thought it was cool. This is on vintage, hard rock, progressive, psychedelic, heavy guitar music. This is, a heavy guitar rock band out of the US. I forget exactly where. Who did they cover here now? No cover. They're not the ones who did the cover. Anyway, Bob Sharples on drums. That name sounds really familiar, doesn't it? This album, the recording quality is a bit dodgy, although I heard it sounds better than it originally did. However, it is a nice, heavy guitar-based early heavy rock, heavy metal album out of the 70s, and interesting stuff on here. I think it was Lone Soul Road, which I liked best, which I think you can find on YouTube. Okay, Sir Lord Baltimore, Kingdom Come, and their second self-titled album. Very famous for being one of the early American heavy rock bands with really aggressive vocals, and also the second band ever to have the heavy metal tag appended to them when Mike Saunders wrote in a review that they had the best heavy metal licks in the book about their album. Yes, very great. Anybody who talks about proto-metal, early heavy rock will tell you this is an essential album, Sir Lord Baltimore. The second album a lot of people don't like because it starts to get a bit progressive. However, there are still some really great heavy songs, including Woman Tamer, which I like, which is very much like the first album. So, Sir Lord Baltimore. I have next here Stray. This is their anthology from 1970 to 77. Their first 2 albums are, again, more of this hard rock sound. They do sound a bit like Sweet, I find, because they have that kind of layered chorus, not layered, the kind of chorus vocals. Good heavy stuff. The second album actually has a song called Suicide, which is pretty heavy and very gruff vocals, almost like a precursor to later metal vocals. I don't have the debut. A lot of people will tell you the debut is a great heavy rock album to get from 1970. Their later stuff, it's more or less straightforward guitar rock band, not particularly heavy. It's just good, but I'm looking for the stuff like All in Your Mind, the first track on here. Long one, very cool. So, again, early 70s, hard rock band. Nice. Got about 8 more albums to get through here. By the way, you'll notice there is no Black Sabbath, no Deep Purple, no Led Zeppelin, and no Uriah Heep in here. I specifically left those out because, well, what else is there to say? Everybody knows them and that. I want to find stuff that maybe you might have heard about or you do know about, but it's kind of rare, or perhaps you don't know about it. So, we're going to move on to a band that some people know about. This is T2. It'll all work out in Boomland. 1970, I think. They released this album and then they recorded a second one which was never released until many years later on CD. This is also one of those bands that crosses between heavy rock with heavy riffing and prog because they have more jazz influenced sections. And side 2, it's just one song called Morning, 21 minutes 14 seconds long. Side 1 is just 3 tracks in circles. I like kind of hard rock, jazz influenced hard rock, progressive hard rock, And then No More White Horses, which is the big dramatic piece with horns in there, but has that heavy riff that we proto-metal hunters like so much. T2. Put it over here. Okay, this one here, UFO 1 by UFO, who became famous in the 70s with Michael Schenker on guitar. Here they are. Prior to Michael Schenker, they released 2 albums without him before he joined, and this is the first one, and it is basically a loud, hard rock, blues-based, blues-influenced hard rock album. Some really cool stuff on here. Timothy I really like because it has the loudest, grittiest chords. But pretty cool stuff to hear if you're interested in what they sounded like before Michael Schenker joined. This is a band, I think, out of New York, Valhalla. This is their 1969 soul release. They are another Vanilla Fudge type band. So psychedelic, heavy guitar, heavy organ, plus quite diversity in their music, really. Not every track is a heavy rocker, but when they do rock out good and heavy, they do. And Hard Times, the first song, that's my favorite one. And it starts right off the bat. Dun 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 dun. Yeah, cool stuff on here. If you like that late 60s psychedelic stuff, which can go off into different directions, sometimes a bit lightweight, but anyway, yeah, it's not easy to get a hold of, but if you can find it, you can also listen to it on YouTube. Cool stuff. Alright, no talk about early 70s heavy metal would be complete without Grand Funk Railroad. I don't have any of their original albums here. You know what, I have an LP in the closet though. I used to have I have their first 2 albums on LP. Yeah, that's right. Anyway, Grand Funk Railroad. Their first 2 albums, that was where they were really the hard, heavy rock band. Lots of grooving guitar, hard-hitting drums, really flying funky bass, Mark Farner's vocals soaring, distortion, really cool stuff. Grand Funk are often talked about from an early 70s perspective as a heavy metal band. There are some interviews where someone is speaking to Mark Farner about Grand Funk being a heavy metal band, which he doesn't seem to deny, but he doesn't embrace either. He just kind of says, yeah, well, anyway, we were rock and roll band. Of course, Grand Funk later changed their sound. They lightened up. They used the distortion less. Songs like We're an American Band. What's that famous? Locomotion. Yeah, that's it. And some other ones. More guitar rock, a little more mainstream oriented. But the first 2 albums are really cool. And a lot of the tracks from the first 2 albums appear on, what is it? Grand Funk, The Collector's Series, and More of the Best. Might just go out and get those first 2 albums on CD. Anyway, why not? Next we have an American band, Yesterday's Children. Basically a almost post-psychedelic heavy rock band. Some really cool stuff. They do Evil Woman, a cover of Spooky Tooth. Lots of other cool tracks. Sailing, Hunter's Moon. Great heavy rock from 1970. They had only the 1 album. Interesting cover with the band members dressed as babies in a stroller. Pretty cool album though. I should actually listen to this again. Now we have Wicked Lady. I'm going to censor the boobies here and make it a family channel. Wicked Lady were a UK band, I think a 3-piece band. They toured around the UK a lot. They recorded a lot of their stuff in studio or at home, but never had an album released. There is The Axeman Cometh, and there is one more, which is basically a collection of their stuff recorded between 69 and 72. Wicked Lady, basically it's straightforward stuff. I mean, you've got somebody playing the guitar, drums, bass. I think it's the guitarist or the bassist or the vocals. That's it. Not much else going on there, but lots of cool riffs. I personally find the drumming to be a little bit ordinary. There's not so much excitement going on there, but some, if you like early 70s, late 60s, early 70s heavy riffs, there's a lot of cool stuff on here. Okay, 10 years after are usually not associated with heavy metal. However, back in the 80s, there was a Canadian-produced album called Metallion. They had a section called Roots of Metal, and they featured 10 Years After in there. Most of 10 Years After stuff is very blues-based. I think most of their career is blues-based rock. However, for this 1969 album, shh. There are some rather heavy songs on here, and some of their other albums did feature some harder hitting blues stuff, but Bad Scene, the opening track, has some blazing guitar work by Alvin Lee. I think he was trying to be the fastest guitar player around at one point. And lots of fuzzy guitar and just like this, not really a riff, just buzzing the chords while the guitar solo is flying away. Pretty cool stuff on here. I Woke Up This Morning, a blues song, but hitting hard. Some other cool stuff as well. So, this is my favorite 10 Years After album. Alright, one last band to talk about. Zoot from Australia. They were basically a bubblegum pop band out of the late 60s, all dressed in pink. And then a young guitarist named Rick Springfield joined them, and they completely changed over. They were suddenly the bad boys. And you can find a video of their cover of Eleanor Rigby, which is on here, recorded in 1970. I think the bass player actually is wearing a black shirt with a white inverted cross on it. Pretty wild stuff. And basically from The Freak, Evil Child, and Eleanor Rigby, this is where the band has changed from being a bubblegum pop rock band into a really heavy rock band. Their cover of Eleanor Rigby is amazing for 1970 heavy rock. Very cool. Alright, and then after that, the band members all went off their own ways. Rick Springfield, of course, later on went off to the US, became Rick Springfield, the singer. Daryl Cotton, I believe the vocalist, went off and did stuff. Beeb Birtles went off to do Little River Band, I believe. Okay, so all these albums, they're all between 1969 1970, featuring some great heavy rock, hard rock, psychedelic, heavy psychedelic stuff. All albums I would recommend checking out. There might be a couple of others I missed, I haven't got yet. Anyway, that's my bit for today. Music is a journey. Proto-metal, 69, 1970. See you for the next episode later on. I'm done.